my experience in archaeology and art and what led me to glass. Was there an incident, or was it a gradual progression? Well, I suppose part of it was a gradual progression, but really the first thing that absolutely inspired me. When I was a young archaeologist, I worked for the Museum of London as a finds assistant, and then I went on to become an illustrator for what is now English Heritage. And on my desk one day came the most gorgeous necklace of glass beads. I mean, I was in my early 20s, just out of uni and art school, and it was absolutely enormous. It's sort of about that big. And it was found in the grave in Portway East in Andover of a young girl who was 12 years old or thereabouts. And I was absolutely enchanted. It was simply beautiful, even though it was so old and corroded. And I drew it, and it became out in the report, all in black and white. And then move on umpty-tum years, where I've had a whole career writing books on jewellery. I came out of archaeology for quite a long time, and then decided, and I kept remembering that necklace and thinking I'd love to find out how it was made. And by then I'd studied jewellery making and silversmithing and enamelling, but I'd never touched on hot glass. So I decided, after the last book I wrote for a big publisher, I thought, no, I'm through with deadlines. I want to go back and research. And that's what I've spent the last 6 years doing, learning how to work in hot glass and to find out how that beautiful necklace from that little girl was made. And it's just snowballed. I have found it the most fascinating subject. Well, training is not readily available at all in hot glass bead making. There are some very talented artists about making modern beads. And there are, well, in this country, it's really quite hard to find a teacher. And I realized I was beginning to play around with it and investigate it and read books on it. You can find books on how to use hot glass to make beads, lamp work, bead making. And I had long before, I had met a lovely man called Mike Poole, who works as Tillerman Beads, and he does reproduction beads, replica beads, as his living. And I got in touch and I said, Mike, help, I want to do some research. Can you give me a day's workshop, please? Because he does teach. And I had a wonderful day with him. And that was all the training I had, because I'd done an awful lot of other beads, silver beads, bead making, silversmithing, and so on. I think I was already quite well tuned to doing something like that. But I will say now, it's probably the hardest jewelry technique that I have ever tried. And my early disasters were multiple, absolutely multiple. So it's been a fascinating journey, and I owe a lot to Mike Poole in that single day. But then once he showed me all the basics, I really wanted to pretend I was a new Anglo-Saxon bead maker learning. So I limited myself to the simple tools, and off I went, pretending I was an apprentice, because that's useful information in archaeology as well. Are some of these really grotty beads apprentice beads? Somebody learning the ways of how to do it. So the heat source that I use is a blowtorch. It's a very simple blowtorch. It's called a hot point. It's not adjustable. Like modern glass bead makers would use much more sophisticated tools. And of course, it's not what they would have had in Anglo-Saxon times or Roman times. So I did quite a study, and there is a paper I have written, which I can give you links to, on furnaces and the likely heat sources. And as I studied the beads, I realized that some were being made using lamp work, and some are made using furnace techniques where you work inside a glory hole. And you can see the difference on the beads. And this practical angle has never really been embraced, I don't think, fully by archaeologists. There's a lot more stories in those beads than people have been realizing. And so I decided, well, I could build a little volcano furnace. There's a lot of work being done in Scandinavia and in Reba of these the type of furnaces. A man called Thomas Rhizome has written a wonderful book called The Reba, Bead Maker of Reba. And that I talked to Thomas and talked to others like Frank Wiesenberg and other people who've been building their own furnaces. And I thought, I'm not going to do that because it'll slow me down. I want to concentrate on the I want to concentrate on the beads and how they were made. So I used this torch reaches similar temperatures to these wood-fired small furnaces with a sort of like a volcano with a hole at the top. And you sit over the top of this. But with a blowtorch, it's pushing away from you and you have a much narrower field of heat, which actually makes it more difficult. But in lamp work, you're moving in and out of the heat to control the glass and stop it all melting and just getting into a splotch. So that's why I decided to do that. And it's given me all the information that I seem to need, which is excellent. So different coloured glass with different malleability, depending on the content of colour. Now, that is the theory, and you're quite right with the question. That is the theory. But in fact, in practice, different colours do not make a huge difference. If you've got, say, more one pigment, like the oxides that are used to pigment the glass, is making the glass softer, you just don't work in such a hot bit of the flame. So you can easily adapt. And well, I say easily. At first, it's disasters all the time. Hot glass on your lap, that sort of thing. You have to be so careful because it's obviously you can get burned. But I've built up over the last 5 odd years, yes. How do I start? With bead, I go around museums photographing beads and asking permission to photograph beads, and I've got thousands and thousands of photographs of the Anglo-Saxon beads. And what I do is I just print out one of my photographs. I don't sketch, even though I'm an illustrator. I might have a life-size image of it, so I know the size I'm working to. That's about it. And I have my mandrel, and I use sticks of glass, and I just go for it over the heat. And you twist, you melt your glass, and you wind it on. And this is all in the video. And do you have to investigate the glass content? No, there's no need to investigate the content. You're just looking at the colours. That's all I'm doing. I'm not bothering for the practical process. I'm not bothering with what the content of the chemical content of the glass is. Can you tell if an original bead used recycled glass at all? They're all recycled glass. All these beads almost certainly are recycled glass. The ones made by local Anglo-Saxon bead makers. That I have found in my research that about half of the beads in Anglo-Saxon graves were most certainly made by local bead makers. Don't think they all came with bead makers immigrating into Britain, not at all. They're not found anywhere else, a lot of the types that we have. And so I rather like that. Hey, these are made in Britain or, well, in ancient Anglo-Saxon Britain. Is there a technique yet? Oh my goodness, yes. Well, there's quite a few. I've managed to trounce most of them. And when I can see the tool marks on the beads that look identical to the tiny tool marks you can sometimes see on the ancient beads, I know I must have got the technique pretty well right. But there's one type that has been driving me crazy, and it's not made in Britain. It was probably made in big workshops in the Middle East. It's a drawn bead, and it's got layers of gold and silver foil, some of them. They're called segmented, these beads. And you have to roll them. You make your bead as a long strip of glass and then you roll it on a former, but it's built up in layers. And nobody yet that I know of, and if anybody has managed to replicate this. So if anybody else has got to the bottom of this problem, I would very much like to hear. What would I like to make next? Do I have a wish list? Well, the beads that I have been studying most lately are the most glorious ones called annular twists, and they are only found in Britain, and they're towards the end of the 7th century. And there are some popping up. They were obviously very special beads. And sometimes jewelers have mounted them in gold. They're so special. And they've got very fine twists of glass to decorate these glorious colours. They come in all colours. And so far, I've only found 32 in Britain. So they're pretty rare. And I need to work hard and try and replicate it because it's a very complicated bead to make, very hard. And yes, that's the first one on my wish list.